Hello and welcome to the Arise interview. 60 minutes of big questions about the big stories from the news and beyond, with fresh insight and critical analysis. I'm Charles Dadi Onyeama. Coming up in the next hour, my guest today is Nigeria's Foreign Minister, Geoffrey Onyeama, a seasoned international bureaucrat and former top United Nations executive at the World Intellectual Property Organization, who for the last 4 years has exerted leadership over Nigeria's foreign affairs and is one of this country's 3 key ministers on security matters. He's also the 4th son of Charles Dadi Onyeama, Nigeria's judge at the International Court of Justice in The Hague in the 60s and 70s, and is a lawyer with degrees from Cambridge University and LSE in the UK, Colombia University in the US, and the University of Ibadan here in Nigeria. Geoffrey Onyeama, coming up in a moment. Now, he comes across as calm and unruffled, even when the political waters are churning in a storm. It's the art of the foreign minister, and Geoffrey Onyeama brings the weight of his international experience to bear as he plots and plans and discusses and argues about the best way to impose, or at least negotiate, Nigeria's will and to find a way for the country in the world. From his ministerial office in Abuja, Mr. Onyeama dispatches diplomatically worded communications, expressing everything from disappointment to the White House following the travel restrictions, to promises of definitive measures against South Africa over xenophobic violence, and closer to home, facing down neighboring states that want a U-turn on border closure. To say the least, he's a man presiding over an institution that is freighted with history, but it is also his job to change it according to Nigeria's evolving political interests, as well as adapt it to the prevailing global geopolitical winds. Well, in a moment, we'll find out more about the life and the role of the Nigerian Foreign Minister, Geoffrey Onyeama. But first, here he is, speaking just last week at the 43rd session of the Human Rights Council in Geneva.
Human Rights Council. Mr. Vice President, this session is holding at a time the world is preparing to mark the 25th anniversary of the 4th World Conference on Women and adoption of the Beijing Declaration and Platform for Action. This milestone is pivotal for accelerated realization of gender equality and the empowerment of all women and girls the world over. It is pertinent to recognize that gender equality and the empowerment of women and girls will make a substantial contribution to the progress and prosperity of nations in line with the Sustainable Development Goals. We must recognize that the achievement of society's full human potential and sustainable development will not be possible if vulnerable members of our societies do not enjoy their full human rights and opportunities. Women and girls, for instance, must enjoy equal access to quality education, economic resources, political participation, as well as equal opportunities for employment, leadership positions, and participation in decision-making at all levels. The promotion and protection of fundamental human rights and fundamental freedoms are critical elements for the achievement of international peace and security and the attainment of the 2030 Sustainable Development Agenda. It is for this reason that the international community must support the mandate and operations of the Human Rights Council in its quest to strengthen institutions in upholding the human rights of all, especially as it relates to gender equality and women empowerment, as well as the elimination of all forms of discrimination and violence against women and girls across the globe. I seize this opportunity to reiterate that Nigeria remains committed to the promotion and protection of human rights, devoid of any discrimination, in line with the Universal Declaration of Human Rights.
Geoffrey Onyeama, and I'm delighted to say that I'm joined now in the studio by the man himself, Nigeria's Minister of Foreign Affairs, Geoffrey Onyeama. Thank you very much indeed for coming in.
Thank you very much.
I know you've had a stressful few weeks, as always, nothing out of the ordinary, so we appreciate your taking the time to be here. And just watching that clip, is it important to have what the former British Foreign Secretary Robin Cook called an ethical foreign policy? I'm just wondering if there is a natural tension between realpolitik, promoting Nigeria's national interest, and standing up for human rights.
Good question. Yes, there's very much a place for ethical foreign policy, and we try to uphold that. Foreign policy that's driven by our principles, and you can see this basically actually in the speeches of Mr. President at the UN General Assembly. If you read or read his speeches over the last 3 UN General Assemblies, you will get a sense of the ethical soul of this government.
And I mean, that ethical soul, though, has to be matched by realpolitik, doesn't it? Because, you know, Nigeria is fighting an insurgency in the northeast. The country's security forces not always known to adhere to the practice of human rights. So perhaps it's so much better to under-promise and over-deliver.
Well, I wouldn't agree with saying that the Nigerian foreign forces, military forces, are not known to adhere to human rights principles. I think that's not true. On the contrary, the armed forces is institutionalizing the respect and promotion of human rights. So they've embedded within the defense architecture of the country a human rights desk. And there are programs, training, and otherwise for the military on human rights obligations. So we're trying to make that part of the culture of of the military.
You're trying to, but you're not quite there yet.
Well, no, you're dealing with human beings, and nowhere in the world is anything perfect, because there are always going to be human beings. There are going to be individuals who don't adhere to the rules and the regulations and so forth. But the most important thing is that the institution itself must embrace an ethical vision, or a moral vision. And so this is what we have sought to imbibe and institutionalize in our military.
Now, obviously, you've come back minister for a second term as foreign minister of Nigeria. That's a very important position. I mean, it's one of the 3 key ministries in Nigeria. That's clearly your return a vote of confidence. But in those 4 years in office for you, what would you say has been your biggest achievement as Nigeria's Minister for Foreign Affairs?
Well, first of all, I wouldn't...
That may not be a very fair question, but nevertheless, I'll ask it.
Yeah, I will. First and foremost, I wouldn't necessarily say that the ministry is amongst the 3 key ministries. I think all the ministries are extremely important, and they are all building blocks to achieving the vision of the president. And nor again do I feel very comfortable with the question of my greatest achievements, because I'm actually just a servant of the president, and I implement his vision and his directives.
I understand that. So if I rephrase it and say, what has been the greatest foreign policy achievement of this administration?
I would say there were legion, actually.
But obviously, for this government, your starting point would be the vision of the president. And he impersonates, to that extent, the vision of the country. And the first 4 years, his vision was very clear. His priorities were very clear, and there were three of them. Security, of course, then the fight against corruption, governance, and the economy, jobs creation, and all that. And of course, so the Ministry of Foreign Affairs tries to leverage on all the assets it has at its disposal to help achieve those, at least to contribute to the achievement of those goals. Well, in the security area, the mobilization of countries to support us in the fight against Boko Haram, the maintenance of good relations with the countries around us. It might sound easy and obvious, but if you look around the world, you will see that maintaining good relations with neighbors is actually not as easy as it sounds. And it's been able to do that and also gain their respect, been able to enthrone democracy and the acceptance of democracy in the sub-region. So, interventions in the Gambia and outreach to a number of other countries that looked as if they might not follow the democratic path. Maintaining peace in the sub-region, again, with direct engagement. Pushing for an African security architecture, which has now been brought about. Then also, peacekeeping presence around the continent. So the security side has been, very successful, one would say. Then as far as anti-corruption is concerned, clearly you can see from the recognition that Mr. President has received as the AU champion for anti-corruption, the successes of the United Nations through the resolution on illicit financial flows that was passed, and pushing other governments to join us in the fight against corruption, the returning of assets. And they themselves, like David Cameron when he was Prime Minister of the UK, organizing a huge event on anti-corruption, and the President was very much present there.
I apologize for interrupting you, but we'll take a break and we'll come straight back to you. You're watching the Arise interview, plenty more still ahead as we continue our chat with Nigeria's Foreign Minister Geoffrey Onyeama. Stay with us. Welcome back to the Arise interview. I'm Charles Dadi. My guest today is the affable and urbane Nigerian Minister of Foreign Affairs, Geoffrey Onyeama. And in this age of the text message and cheap flights, his job of diplomacy is no longer a matter of telegrams and dispatches, as it was in the early 1960s when his father was a Nigerian Supreme Court Justice before heading out to the International Court of Justice at The Hague. Now, increasingly, what counts is personal relationships between the foreign minister and his opposite numbers in Washington, Europe, and across the world. And so it was that when the US blindsided the Buhari government by putting Nigeria on its list of countries that would face broad travel restrictions, the Nigerian authorities, ostensibly on Mr. Onyeama's advice, calculated that a soft touch with the Trump administration would prove more effective in getting the travel ban lifted than a defiant display of disapproval. So off to Washington went Mr. Onyeama to meet US Secretary of State Mike Pompeo, and it was, as one US diplomat put it, a masterwork of classic diplomacy. And by the time it was over, it was all smiles and handshakes and signals from the Americans that the two countries would expand cooperation and that the ban could soon be lifted. Take a look at a short clip of their joint press conference in Washington.
First thing, I want to thank you for being here with me today, for joining us with a big delegation to work to address all of these important opportunities that our two nations have between us. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Secretary. Well, first of all, I'd like to say it's been a great pleasure to be back in Washington to attend the binational commission between the United States and Nigeria. On the way here, or just before coming, we were somewhat blindsided with the announcement of the visa restrictions by the U.S. And, of course, a lot of people back home in Nigeria understood it and put different interpretations and different spins on it, but it's essentially very straightforward, and it was very gratifying to come here speaking to U.S. officials and to understand more clearly the reasoning behind this. And essentially, their security measures that were taken, with regards to passports, electronic passports, lost and stolen passports, data, being shared, criminal histories being, made available and shared of known terrorists and suspected terrorist information also being made available. And, we've identified all those requirements, and we had actually started working on all of them. And, and we know, and the U.S. Officials have also confirmed that we have been able to tick most of those boxes. With regards to lost and stolen passports, we're putting in place the architecture that will now make that the information and the data on that immediately available to the U.S. and all the member states and member countries of Interpol. And we hope to have that up and running, very soon, and no longer going through third parties.
The Nigerian Minister of Foreign Affairs, Geoffrey Onyeama, and he is with me in the studio at the moment. Thank you very much indeed for coming in. Obviously, a lot of people want to hear more about that, your time in America, but just before we went on break, you were finishing off telling us the foreign policy achievements of this government.
Yeah, I mean, I had talked about the security successes,
yes,
and the anti-corruption. Yeah, and then, on the economy, Mr. President has been particularly successful in getting invited by all the major countries and all the leaders. It's been actually extremely impressive just how much they wanted to have him in their countries or to visit Nigeria. And those visits have been an excellent opportunities to also push the economic angle and invite foreign direct investment into the country. So, trade is also about confidence in a country, and as you said at the beginning, good connections also. And Mr. President has been able to establish that and get the country to re-establish those links with,
but I mean,
with a lot of
Nigerians would say they're not seeing evidence of
well,
that.
if you look at the statistics, I think in many countries, these things don't trickle down immediately. If you look at from where we're coming from, when this government came into office in 2015, there's been huge gains, on the economic front. But I think most importantly, it's the building the foundation for sustainable development. It's not about, when the price of oil is 140, Nigeria is ranked as, an economic success story, but it's not sustainable. So what this government has done is building the foundations and addressing those areas that would sustain growth, infrastructure, transport, self-reliance, and food security, and those kinds of areas. And so I think, this president has been very successful in now laying that foundation that will sustain the industrialization and economic development of this country. So it will not be boom and bust, boom and bust.
Well, hopefully if we've got time before the end of the program, we'll get back to that. But let me just talk about that clip we saw of yourself and the US Secretary of State Mike Pompeo in Washington. You mentioned there that Nigeria had been blindsided by the action taken by the Americans to include Nigeria, in a list of countries that had travel restrictions imposed on them. I mean, that must have been quite embarrassing walking in there and that suddenly finding that Nigeria was on the list. I would have thought that that's part of the sort of behind-the-scenes diplomacy that the Nigerian ambassador in US and that sort of thing would have been sort of informed about.
Well, I mean, that's why I use the term blindsided, because it's something that happened, took us completely unawares. And the point is that for a long period of time, our immigration people and security people have been working with the Americans on precisely those issues and those concerns, been working with Interpol. And, so when you're working with partners or institutions, to address certain problems, fix certain issues, address their concerns, we were not expecting at that time that a decision such as was taken would be taken when it was, without any sort of warning as such. But having said that, to be fair to the Americans, they had made it clear that there were areas of great concern to them. Yes, we were working to address those, but I mean, their point is that we obviously were not doing so as expeditiously as they would have liked, and hence this position. So for us, rather than crying over spilt milk, the decision had been obviously taken. We wanted to understand the reasoning behind it, and to be sure that it was purely technical, as opposed to any other reason, just that it was technical, so that we would know precisely where we stood. And from the feedback and the interaction, we understand that it is technical. So it's good to know that, so we know exactly what we hadn't done and what more needs to be done. And we're still working with the Americans on those, and hopefully in an environment of good faith between two friendly countries, we expect and hope that it will be fixed.
Well, certainly watching that video, there was, the rapport between both of you was really quite impressive, and there seemed to be this air of conviviality in spite of clearly what was something that irked a lot of Nigerians and caused a lot of anger and frustration back here in this country. I mean, as we said in the intro, in the old days, diplomacy used to be a matter of telegrams and dispatches. Now it's a personal touch. How much did that come into play during your meeting with Mike Pompeo, who is your counterpart in the US? I mean, how much did you have to woo him to get to that, what we saw in the final analysis, which was this great rapport on television between the two of you?
No, I wouldn't say wooing him or anything like that. No, not at all. These are two sovereigns, two sovereign countries. Nigeria is a sovereign country, the largest country in Africa, and projected soon actually to surpass the US in terms of population and all that. And the US, of course, is the number one economic and military power in the world. And we're merely we're representatives of principles.
Yes.
I'm representing my country, my president, and he likewise. So we had met before. I mean, we before we went out there, we discussed at some length, and we had a very good rapport. He's very friendly, very congenial person to interact with, and I was actually. He knows the sub-region. He knows West Africa well, and so there was that understanding there, and we were very much in tune. We agreed on almost all the issues.
We've got about a minute before we have to take another break. What would you say on a more serious level, beyond the sort of the congeniality, that meeting achieved for Nigeria?
Well, I mean, it remains to be seen, what it achieved. But I always believe that good relations and good personal relations are very important in these things. I mean, we've seen how strained personal relations has led to war in amongst various countries. So it's good that we have that good relationship. We interacted very well together, but not just with him, but also with his team, behind the scenes.
But let's talk about something else that's hugely current at the moment, the coronavirus. Nigerian students in the Chinese province of Wuhan, there apparently may be about 60 of them there. Recently they cried out to President Buhari to come and take them home, but the Information Minister, Lai Mohammed, said they haven't expressed a desire to return home. Can you clarify which it is?
Yeah, I mean, some of them have, indicated that, but it's not a realistic proposition because, there's a lockdown in China, and especially Wuhan has been, isolated. So even if they wanted to travel out, it's not quite sure how that would take place. But in any case, we got medical opinion, and the advice was for them to self-isolate in China, and for the government to make their stay as comfortable as possible, so ensuring that they are well supplied and all that. That was the best approach.
Well, I mean, the impression we have from reports from Wuhan is that these Nigerian students have been in lockdown since January 23rd, and they feel abandoned by the Nigerian government. They need support, and they say they're not getting it.
Well, no, they are. I've been in touch personally with our ambassador in China, and he's been keeping me informed of the support that is being provided, material support as well. Because the most important thing is to keep them fed and clothed, essentially. And this is what is being done. The mission intervened directly itself, our embassy, and then we also, from headquarters, are transferring funds to continue that support.
Is it possible that the Nigerian government is in effect keeping the students out of the way, because this country wouldn't be able to cope with the quarantine and the health care of the virus if the virus became apparent here?
Well, no, I think it was more a question of, as I said, we got medical advice, and it was just more a question of the best way to address the situation, and it was felt that they're staying where they were in self-isolation. If they came back to Nigeria, they would have to be isolated as well, it'll, cause probably a lot more, disruption. So you have to balance everything.
Right. So there is then a sense that the students are safer in China than they would be if they were repatriated back to Nigeria, because it seems like the students are scared, but the Nigerian government is equally scared.
No, as I said, it was an advice, a medical advice that was given, that under all the circumstances, taking everything into account, that the best solution was for them to remain where they were, and in self-isolation, and for the government to support them there.
Okay, let me get back to your job as foreign minister. Obviously this was one of them, but the fact that you're balancing the two sort of demands of your job, the convergent demands, and how you sort of deal with it. Because of course, behind every discussion of Nigeria's foreign policy is one sobering fact, and that is that Nigeria simply isn't a great power and possibly can't afford to do what it used to do in the past. I mean, not your fault, not this government's fault. They've inherited years of it, but at least in the past they were able to go to places like Liberia and Sierra Leone and fight wars and restore peace and so on. I mean, how far does Nigeria's diminishing role in the world constrain the role of the foreign minister himself?
Well, it's quite interesting because, you know, in your nostalgia there, you're talking about wars. But, you know, I think it's a good thing if there are no wars around and the country doesn't have to, you know, because
well, this is whether it has the capacity.
We will not. Well, we've not had wars. We sent in air, sea forces to go to the Gambia that pushed the president to abide by the you know, the voting of his people, the voice of his people. We have contingents. In fact, Nigeria is one of the top UN peacekeeping countries.
Was or is?
Around the world. Troop contributing countries, they call it. And you see, the thing is this. In the 60s and 70s, there was a decolonization of Africa. You know, so you know, when people think back nostalgically to the days when Nigeria used to flex its muscles, I think by and large they usually refer to the battle for Luanda, the Angolan struggle, when Nigeria nationalized British Petroleum.
Yes, absolutely.
And
that was something I was going to bring up, but I'm glad you did.
Yeah, and that situation. You know, as I say, it's horses for horses. You know, that was the situation we were faced with then. Decolonization of Africa and apartheid South Africa and so on and so forth. But that's a different situation today.
Yeah, but of course it's also different economically and in terms of the military clout that Nigeria can exert, because Nigeria was considerably wealthier as a country at that time and dominated affairs financially and militarily across Africa. Well,
we dominated affairs militarily because there might have been conflicts around Africa that you don't have now. You know, but you know, obviously, you know, President Trump used the term America first, but Mr. President's approach to things is that let us focus on Nigeria, prosperity for Nigerians. You know, this has to be your immediate mandate when you're elected to office, and that's what we really need to be focusing on.
Right, but keeping that in mind, would it be fair then to say that Nigeria has become less important in the scheme of continental and global things as a result of that policy of the government? The Office of Foreign Minister, your office, has had to adjust itself to these changing circumstances and not sort of punching Nigeria above its weight, as it were.
No, on the contrary, I would say that Nigeria is more important. And how do you test this, or how do you measure this? The best way is how you're seen by others, you know, by other countries. And if you look at the last, since President Muhammadu Buhari became president, he has been invited to China, to France, Paris, to the UK, to Washington, Moscow. That in itself is a sign of the importance of a country, because the big countries, the major countries, you know, want you to come and visit. And who's been coming here? And Germany, of course, where he's also invited. And, you know, at one time, you saw almost in a week, the UK Prime Minister was here, the German Prime Minister was here. And so Nigeria's importance is still there. And what makes Nigeria important, as far as we're concerned really now, we want to be an economic power, okay? Not by dint of the fact that we produce 2.2 billion barrels of petroleum, but we want to be an economic power through productivity of our people. We want to generate wealth, within our country, and to deliver prosperity through that to the people of our country. And if you look at, for instance, since the Second World War, the two countries that you could almost say were not the most important in the world when it started, Japan and Germany, poor countries, no military power, no military force as such, because they were banned from having, a strong military, became economic powers.
So that's Nigeria's aim.
So our aim is,
power.
yes, is really to focus on
Okay.
the economy. And that's what really counts in the world today.
Okay, let's take a break. We'll come back in a minute. You're watching the Arise interview. Plenty more still ahead as we continue our chat with Nigeria's Minister for Foreign Affairs, Geoffrey Onyeama. Stay with us. Welcome back to the Arise interview. I'm Charles Dadi. My guest today is the hard-working Nigerian Minister of Foreign Affairs, Geoffrey Onyeama, whose job is to ensure that Nigeria continues to play an important regional and global role, as well as domestically here in Nigeria. His canny international knowledge, strong diplomatic experience, and impressive educational qualifications, not to mention broad language skills — he speaks fluent German and French — could potentially be what Nigeria needs to mastermind a transformation of its role in the world today, from a lumbering regional power of dubious international clout into one of the important players on the continental and world stage. Mr. Onyeama has been President Buhari's foreign minister since 2015 and has been trying ever since to forge new dialogues and economic relationships with African countries, the EU, the US, China, and other emerging powers. But to what extent has Nigeria's limited economic clout, investment flows, and military capabilities managed to earn it a place at that table? And with me in the studio, Nigeria's Foreign Minister, Geoffrey Onyeama. Thank you very much indeed for staying with us. And you look at the global geopolitics today. Where does Nigeria fit in?
Well, if it's geopolitics and you're looking at Africa, Nigeria is right there at the very top. If it's global politics, that'll be multilateral level. Nigeria is also a significant player within the UN. We have the President of the General Assembly. We have the Deputy Secretary General of the United Nations, and we have a strong presence internationally.
I mean, does the foreign ministry, and this is probing a bit into the way the behind the scenes, does the Nigerian foreign ministry sometimes come into conflict with the presidency over Nigeria's foreign policy and which direction it should go? I mean, I expect that you advise the president and that you sit down and sometimes say, well, this is not a good idea. I mean, let's not go this way. Do you have that sort of conflict?
No.
I like that. Do you avoid that type of conflict?
They don't arise. The president is a boss. We're here to serve him. We're here to make him succeed and for him to realize his vision. So the presidency, and the president himself, and he's a very, very astute and an excellent diplomat, and very fine.
Well, he doesn't come across that way. I mean, when people watch him, they don't feel inspired.
Well, I don't know. That's not fair, and that's not accurate.
Well, I mean, the fact is that he's just not the most commanding presence when you sort of line him up against a lot of other leaders?
I would say that the exact opposite is the case. If you look at the African issues, conflict areas, they always want him to be present, even when he doesn't want to be. For instance, chairing ECOWAS, he didn't want it. He had too much on his plate at the time. And there were all these issues around. They forced it upon him. I think it was in Togo that they had the meeting. They ambushed him. They said, no, you are the only person. So the confidence they have in him. And, you know, very recently, as you know, there's a political crisis brewing in Guinea, you know, and they said he has to go. He's not chairing the African Union, but please, you...
So he likes to do things behind the scenes.
It's not that he likes to do things... No. The point I'm making is that his peers, all the other presidents, I mean, because you are saying that, oh, he doesn't inspire confidence, but he does.
Inspire confidence to his people, I mean, the ordinary people sort of on the streets of Nigeria, for example. Nigerians, technocrats across the country.
No, what I'm saying is that, because you are asking me about the foreign scene, the international scene, and I'm telling you that we are there, that he is a fine diplomat, astute knowledge and skills on the international relations, and held in extremely high regard by the heads of states of almost all the other countries.
But does he like to conduct international diplomacy himself? I mean, there's some leaders who are like that. Margaret Thatcher, for example, always had to be the one, and she hated taking contingents of people from the Foreign Office in the UK and so on. I mean, does he conduct international diplomacy himself, or does he see the need to rely on you and the Foreign Ministry quite a lot wherever he goes abroad?
No, you know, he has a very, very, very clear sense of what he wants for the country as far as international relations is concerned. And so he lays down very, very clearly and very unambiguously, you know, what those objectives are. And, you know, of course you will, you know, provide him with data and details and also options. For him to select policy options and that kind of thing. That's normal, you know. But in terms of where we're going, why we need to go there, and the benefits we will accrue from going there, he has a very, very finely developed sense of that. And so to that extent, he leads very much from the front.
So he is clearly a leader.
Oh, he's clearly, oh no, as for that, he's clearly a leader. And which is not surprising, because he's been there, he's done that, you know, before. So it's not a new terrain for him. But I must say that he's particularly effective, and that what helps a great deal is the great respect that they have. And when he takes a decision, they all fall in line.
And let's talk about you in the last few minutes that we've got. I mean, what would you say is your own personal style of being foreign minister? I mean, you're a lawyer by training. Do you go through it as if you're preparing for a day in court? How do you sort of actualize on a daily basis your being foreign minister? What's your style?
Well, yeah, I don't self-analyze to that extent. You know, first of all, I have an international relations background, degree background, actually even before I did law. So international relations is actually my passion. So I'm completely comfortable with international relations, and the job I've been doing for the last 30 years is actually international relations. My style is well, as I said, I don't self-analyze that much, but I think that what you do need very steady hands, you know, in other words, a safe pair of hands, and good nerves and calmness. And I get a lot of this, actually. I'm learning a lot from Mr. President. Very, very calm, and a safe pair of hands. And I think that's what you need. You don't need to, it's not about being flashy, you know, and it's not about histrionics and playing to the gallery, you know. It's about, as I said, being very steady, very clear in your objectives, and but at the same time, affability, you know, being able to relate with the diverse groups of people.
Okay, I have to say that you do come across as calm and unruffled. Minister, thank you very much indeed. Geoffrey Onyeama, Nigeria's Minister of Foreign Affairs. Well, that's it for this edition of the Arise interview. Do join us again tomorrow. From me and the entire team here in Abuja, bye-bye, and thank you for watching.